Welcome to this supplemental episode of Framed Season 3. Joining me today is Robin Warder, and Robin hails from Canada. He has a Bachelor of Arts and Humanities from York University in Toronto and a postgraduate honors degree in scriptwriting from Algonquin College in Ottawa. After growing up with a devout interest in unsolved mysteries, Robin published over 100 articles about true crime and pop culture for the websites Cracked and Listverse before launching his podcast, The Trail Went Cold, in February 2016. Before we get started, Robin, I want to acknowledge and have you talk about the articles you wrote before you started your podcast. How did you come to write those? What was your inspiration?
Well, I used to read the website crack.com, which, like you said, had a lot of articles about pop culture and movies. And what was great about it is that it pretty much was like open auditions where you didn't have to have a lot of experience as a writer. It was open to anyone. You could just go into their forum and make a pitch for an idea. And if they accepted it, they would actually pay you to write the articles. And I did about 20 or 30 of them. And then I found a website called listverse.com, which was really my forte because they said their readership particularly loved articles about true crime and unsolved mysteries. So I would do like a lot of top 10 lists about top 10 mysteries about people who vanished during trips to the wilderness and stuff like that. And eventually got to the point in early 2016 where I wanted to go deeper into these cases. I was a big fan of the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, and I wanted to go deep into those cases as well. And thought, why not go up to the next level and try to do a podcast about it where I do 30 to 40-minute episodes talking about the details of these mysteries, and then I spend the rest of the episode providing my theories and analysis. And I'm happy to say that I was inspired to do this after hearing another show called Generation Y, because back in 2016, there were not a lot of true crime podcasts, but you were one of the ones that I listened to that made me think, maybe I should try this.
Oh, well, I love hearing that because I think a lot of you in your writing, so I appreciate you saying that. I don't know how familiar you are with the season 3 of Framed. I know I reached out to you because of the amount of years that you've been looking into cases. You have a real knack for digging in and finding the real details. Been covering the murder of Scott Macklem, also the trial against Frederick Freeman, who was accused of murdering Scott back in the late 80s. And so I want to start by talking about the defense's main strategy in this trial, which was that Frederick Freeman could not be in two places at one time. You talk about alibis, that's about as solid as it gets, right? If we can show he's over here, he can't be over there. The defense also went on to point out inconsistencies in the prosecution's witness statements, along with the lack of physical evidence linking Freeman to the crime. And we'll get into that more later. Freeman, his attorneys called a procession of witnesses who would confirm seeing Freeman on November 5th, 1986 in Escanaba. That's located in Michigan's Upper Peninsula as early as noon. That's 12 p.m. So that meant it would have been impossible for him to have been on the campus of St. Clair Community College in Port Huron at 9 a.m. when the killing occurred. Because it takes about, 6 to 7 hours if you're hurrying to get from Port Huron to Escanaba. Now, the defense said, we're going to look at the timing of the murder and the witness sightings of Freeman and UP, and we're going to show you how that's impossible. And some of these witnesses who testify for the defense weren't even friends with Fred. They didn't even necessarily like him. They just knew about him. And so what do you make of this idea that someone would have an alibi where they can't be in two places at once, and that there are defense witnesses who were familiar with him but weren't friends of his?
Well, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire case, because I believe I first learned about it several years ago when you did an individual episode about it on Generation Y. So that's why I'm glad you're doing a bigger deep dive into it. But the first thing that struck me, I think, when I heard your episode is how the prosecution attempted to push forward a narrative that Temujin Kemsu could have chartered a plane and flown to this location during this limited time frame and then flown back to be seen by these alibi witnesses, which which I thought was one of the most absurd things I had ever heard in a criminal trial, because you're not going to be able to charter a plane without money or some sort of record. So it really looked like they were grasping at straws. And when I heard that, I kept thinking, well, I know that this was a defendant with a questionable background, but you just have to put that aside when you realize that he cannot be in two places at the same time, that he has witnesses placing him in another location who have no motive to lie and defend him. And getting back to Unsolved Mysteries, if you go and watch one of the earliest episodes of the show that's available now on all the streaming sites, they talk about a case about a guy named Michael Scott Martin, who was convicted in 1979 in Texas for robbing $400 from a gas station. I mean, obviously, that's a much less serious crime than murder, but this was another one where everything hinged on the prosecution and defense witnesses, because there were some witnesses, including the guy who owned the gas station, who were certain that Michael Scott Martin was the guy who robbed him and that he was at the scene. But he always maintained that he was about 100 miles away in another town when the robbery was taking place, and he had 5 alibi witnesses at trial, some of whom did not even know him, and said that, yes, I saw him at this particular time. I have no reason to lie for this guy, and I'm telling you the truth, yet he still got convicted. And that's always terrifying to me, this idea that you can have a rock solid alibi, but if the jury disbelieves your witnesses, then you can still get convicted and sent to prison.
Yeah, there are so many things to get into with that. And I'm going to talk about the phantom plane theory a bit more later, but at least when we look at this case and we look at both sides, there are those who argue that he could have had the money. Where it falls apart is, yes, there are no records. And also, it doesn't feel like anyone even looked this up to verify whether they could find out whether there was a phone call made, some kind of arrangement made to get a car, you name it. Why are we looking for his vehicle there if he flew? And then they also say, well, we're just saying this is a possibility. In other words, believe us that people saw him there. How he got there, that's not important to us. But for those of us who like to cross our T's and dot our I's, we want to know. And if you haven't even looked into it, I'm not sure why they can get away with even bringing it up.
Yeah, I just thought of that. That was a major hole in the theory, is that we had witnesses who said that they saw a car speeding away from the murder scene. But if he flew there, then where did he get the car? Did he just happen to steal it and then just drop it off and no one noticed that it was stolen in the first place? And then he got back into his car and then went back to his hometown. So yeah, it's just one of those things where I know they kind of introduced this plane theory at the last minute. But if you're sitting on a jury, like, I don't know how that doesn't destroy a lot of credibility of the prosecution's case.
Yeah, I think there are some answers there for that, though. Let's get into some of the defense witnesses, because Kathleen Dyer, aka Kathy, testified for the defense. She was a registered nurse and a Taekwondo instructor. Now, she taught at this school, Chow's Black Belt Academy Karate School, which is in downtown Escanaba. And she testified that she'd spoken with Freeman, only she didn't know him as Frederick Freeman at the time. She knew him as Mickey Ford, one of his numerous aliases that he would use. Now, she said she talked to him just after her class, and this puts it at about 12:10 p.m. on November 5th, the day of the murder. Scott Macklin would have been killed about 3 hours prior. After she positively identified Fred in court, saying, well, I knew him as Ford, she talked about the conversation they had, which was about nutrition and health. If you've ever spoken with now Temujin Kensu, that's one of his favorite subjects is nutrition and health. He loves talking about that. The defense attorney asked her, are you a personal friend of Freeman's? And she said, no, I'm not. She said, I know who he is. He was simply a passing acquaintance she knew from the school. She never saw him socially. Now, the prosecution wanted to see if she knew exactly what she was talking about, because she was supposed to teach Mondays and Wednesdays. And so they said, are you sure that you had this conversation with him on Wednesday and not on Monday? And she said, well, actually, I didn't come in Monday of that week. The only time I taught that week was on Wednesday, November 5th. She verified, yeah, I ran into Freeman/Ford and talked with him sometime between 12:10 and 1 p.m. And she said, I clearly remember speaking with him moments after the class ended, which, like I said, would have put it at about 12:10. So clearly, Robin, Alibis are only as good as the supporting eyewitnesses and the evidence backing them up. Mark Sherman, who left minutes early before the class ended at noon that same day, also testified in Freeman's defense. Now, considering all the cases you've covered, how well does Freeman's alibi check out for you, given that not only as he said he wasn't anywhere near the crime scene, but that he has eyewitnesses who have come to trial to testify that they saw him just about 3 hours after the murder, when to travel from one city to the other takes about 6 to 7 hours?
Yeah, I do acknowledge that in a lot of these cases, eyewitnesses can be mistaken, either prosecution and defense, and that they could be absolutely sincere. This woman could be telling the truth that she had this specific conversation with them, but she could easily have misremembered which particular day it happened. Maybe it happened on another day before or after the murder. But the fact that she had this specification about which date that she taught classes that week is what I think is very important with alibi witnesses, because if they provide specific details about like a conversation or about the day that they had the conversation, that gives them a lot more credibility, because you know that they're not misremembering the dates. And that's the thing about witnesses. If it's just one where they say, oh, I saw someone across the street from a distance, I'm absolutely positive it was this guy, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because they may be looking at someone else or they may be misremembering the date. But if they remember specific details about a conversation and remember specific details about the day, then you have to put stock into what they're saying.
So Freeman's alibi seems strong. The prosecutor, though, he was not going to just accept it. And he claimed that since Freeman was not seen between 1:30 a.m. and noon on the day of the murder, he could have conceivably flown from Escanaba to Port Huron, gunned down Macklem on the campus, then flown back in time to be seen at the karate school in Escanaba at noon by multiple witnesses. So on one hand, he's trying to say, don't believe these witnesses. But on the other, he's saying, well, if you believe him, then you still have the problem of he could have left anywhere in that time. And so this phantom airplane theory, it really was a wholly unsubstantiated assertion that speculated that Freeman chartered a private plane from Escanaba to Port Huron to commit the crime, then flew back. And according to the state's hypothesis, Freeman would have hired this mystery pilot in Escanaba to fly him round trip, because you can't just get dropped off. You need them to wait on you. The prosecutor says there were 23 landing fields and airports within a half hour of Port Huron. And so the prosecutor reasoned Freeman could have convinced a private pilot to fly him for a few $100s. So to back this up, he called Robert Lee Evans Jr., who was a non-commercial airline pilot, to the stand. And this pilot said, yes, it's entirely feasible to fly between Escanaba and Port Huron in 90 to 100 minutes in a single-engine aircraft. But the thing is, like I said, there's nothing backing this up. There's not a receipt. There's not a flight plan. There's not a credit card charge. There's not a landing location or phone call that would emerge to support this theory. So nothing connects him to this airplane, this phantom plane. And of course, there's this idea of, why would someone be waiting around the airport hoping someone would show up and say, here, I'll pay you $300 so you can fly me round trip. But actually, when we get down there, you'll have to wait for me and then bring me back. Now, obviously, the prosecution's acknowledging that this alibi is pretty good, because they're bringing in a witness who's not even a pilot who said they flew Freeman. They're just someone who's speculating on what's possible. So what do you make of when a prosecution says, well, here's something that's possible, but has seemingly done no research into this to try and back up what they're saying? Because at the end of the day, they'll claim, we're just giving you an idea of what could be possible. And we only brought it up at the end of the trial because it's just an idea. But obviously, they're trying to knock down this alibi, which is seemingly rock solid.
Yeah, it almost seems like they dreamed it up after they learned the alibi and realized that, we've got a big obstacle here to overcome at trial, because what if the jury buys this? So we have to get them alternate scenarios without actually doing the research to find out if the scenario is possible. I mean, they did find someone who said that, yes, you could fly that distance in that time, but you have to find the actual pilot who would be willing to do something like that. And I'm thinking that even at small airports, that if you take off a private plane, you still have to inform air traffic control. You have to radio people about a flight plan. So it is surprising that there aren't any witnesses whatsoever who can corroborate that this flight took place. Even someone who heard the pilot on the radio, or someone who has a record of a plane landing in an airport. I mean, that's just what's so weird is you have like a witness who presents a hypothetical scenario of what could have happened, yet there's no evidence to show that it did happen.
Yeah, it's really, really concerning to me. And I know if you head out on the interwebs, you can find people debating this. And most often I read that people will say, look, it wasn't meant to be the theory about how he got there and back. But honestly, Robin, I understand when people say he had from potentially 1:30 a.m., which is the last time he was around multiple people, until noon, because the only person in that time was Michelle, his girlfriend at the time, and she didn't testify at trial. So I can toss that out, right? But the problem I have is we're just going to give this to the prosecution that this made up theory is okay to put as part of our consideration of whether this man is guilty or not. And it has nothing to do with me, like in terms of, I don't have a horse in this race. Like whether Freeman is guilty or not, that doesn't affect my life. You know, I've not been in that situation, but I'm just trying to understand how anybody could think that even if he could leave earlier, let's say he left at 2 a.m. to go to Port Huron, I don't understand how you could say, well, it makes sense that he could get back after a 9 a.m. murder, make it back to talk to people at 12 p.m. You literally have to say that Kathy is lying when she's a teacher with a long, work record. She's a nurse. She went to court to testify despite not even being friends with Freeman because she was so certain that she talked with him. And I will add to this by saying, yes, the prosecution brought witnesses who said, well, I saw Freeman there on campus, either walking around or in a car. But these are people that didn't know him. And so people are asking me to decide that I'm going to trust someone who didn't even know Freeman, but claimed and couldn't pick him out between a photo and in-person lineup. 2 of the 3 people couldn't get it consistent. They'd never seen him before, yet they know it's him. Whereas we're going to say that Kathy Dyer, a nurse and a Taekwondo teacher, is mistaken somehow, even though she'd already met him and known him and had no horse in the race either, and was just like, no, I talked to him that day. And then another guy was leaving early that day. Sherman was leaving early that day because I think he had a meeting at another school and he had to leave early. I mean, these people are just telling it like it is. Like, I saw him, I know who he is, he's been there before. And somehow we're just supposed to discredit these people when people who didn't even know who he was are saying they saw him.
Well, I've been reading discussions about this case on Reddit, and I knew that there are some people out there who have pushed forward the theory that perhaps Freeman intimidated these witnesses or tampered with them, or maybe like brainwashed them to make them think that they saw him at this dojo at that particular time, but they're either lying or mistaken. I mean, you know the case better than I do. Do you think that there's any evidence to suggest that he did this?
Well, where they have something is that it appears to me like Temujin really does like to talk to people, and I have no doubt he would have wanted to call people to remind them. The problem is if you look at Kathy Dyer, she literally is saying she only taught 2 days a week, and that week she only taught 1 of those days. And she's not the only one who said she saw him there that day. There were multiple people at the karate school who saw him and testified. So it's not like we're counting on one person who just said, yeah, they were there and then didn't give you any information. This is literally, I wasn't there on Monday like I normally am, but I was there on Wednesday. It was the 5th, on and on and on. And then the other person saying, yeah, I was leaving early, that day just before noon. And they testified for him. So I just find it strange that they're going to say, well, because he contacted some of these witnesses that he was interfering. Now, I get that. But if we're going to say he's interfering, then why can't we say the prosecution shouldn't be able to just bring up a theory that isn't backed up by anything?
Yeah, That's true. I mean, they probably thought that if we try to push forward this theory that Freeman intimidated them, or that these good citizens who don't seem to have any history of dishonesty are deliberately lying on the witness stand and perjuring themselves, they're probably going to make a bad impression in front of the jury. It's going to make them look like bullies. So instead of going what might be a more logical strategy, they instead come up with this fantasy scenario involving a plane. And I've always thought that about myself, is that they really shot themselves in the foot when they did this, because even if by chance Freeman was guilty, it still looks really bad for them that they presented this absurd scenario at his trial, and it's one of the reasons why people are still debating it over 40 years later.
Yeah, I'm going to get into that a little bit later about what the repercussions are, but I definitely feel like there are some. And I know at the end of the day, some people tell themselves, well, they got a bad guy put away. That's what matters to them. You and I had this conversation off air. There is something to be said for there are bad people in the world. They have records. People can testify to those records, etc. But that doesn't mean you can just pin any crime on them. We need to know what we're doing. We need to get true justice, which means you need to be able to show who committed the crime and not just go, well, we got a bad person over here, because there are plenty of bad people who have been convicted. And then later, we get some DNA testing done and we find out, oh, well, they had the record. They should have been investigated, but it actually wasn't them.
Yeah, I've always said that one of the worst miscarriages of justice I've ever seen is for a very unlikely target, and that's the notorious confession killer, Henry Lee Lucas. I'm sure you're probably familiar with him. Like, he was a notorious murderer who liked to confess to about 1,000 murders that he committed, most of them false. Did you ever see the Netflix series, The Confession Killer?
Yeah, I'll never look at a strawberry milkshake the same way again.
Yes, exactly. They have some footage, in case you haven't seen it, where they're bribing him with strawberry milkshakes and fast food if he'll confess to a murder. But what's particularly controversial is that the only crime that Lucas ever received the death penalty for was for the murder of an unidentified Jane Doe, who, her real name was Deborah Jackson, but at the time she was nicknamed Orange Socks because they found her body and she was nude, and the only item she was wearing was a pair of orange socks. But 40 years later, they finally identified her as Deborah Jackson. But Lucas confessed to this crime, went on trial, and by this point, he had already been convicted of several other murders. So everyone pretty much just thought that this was just going to be like an easy trial. He confessed. Everyone knew that he was a serial killer. And sure enough, he got convicted after the jury only deliberated for like less than an hour. But it turned out that he had convincing evidence placing him in the state of Florida, about 1,000 miles away from Texas, where the crime took place, on the exact same date. And it wasn't just alibi witnesses. He had like a timesheets that he signed and like a signed paycheck, which showed that he was doing a roofing job in Jacksonville, Florida. So it seemed physically impossible that he could have committed this crime. And years later, people are going, wait a minute, I know that Henry Lee Lucas is a bad guy. He's a murderer and he deserves to be in prison, but there's something very unethical about giving him the death penalty for the one murder that we know he could not have committed, because there's physical evidence placing him at another location. And it got so controversial that George W. Bush, who was governor at Texas at the time, actually agreed to commute Lucas's sentence. So instead of getting the death penalty, it got commuted to life imprisonment. He wasn't officially exonerated, but I think they knew that there was still going to be a backlash if he got executed, and he wound up dying in prison of natural causes. But I'm sure we all know that Henry Lee Lucas is not a sympathetic figure. He definitely deserved to be in prison, and no one would have shed any tears if he had gotten the electric chair or a lethal injection. But you can't execute someone for the crime that they didn't commit. And that's what we say, is that even bad people can be railroaded. And that could be a case as well with Temujin Kensu. He's done some bad things in his life, but if he didn't commit this particular murder, he doesn't deserve to be in prison.
Yeah, I would like to think that justice can be blind. We're not going to look at who you were. We're going to look at, do you fit this case? I've talked at length on this podcast about how they had collected evidence, but it just didn't match up with Freeman. And so what are we left to think? There is this idea that he fits the suspect profile in a way, in that there were claims that he had threatened Scott Macklem and Crystal Merrill, who was his ex-girlfriend, if you want to call her that. Some people argue they were never boyfriend, girlfriend, and he just sort of pushed himself into her life. And I can see both sides on that. But at the end of the day, all they have is a theory that this was the guy who had something to gain by Scott Macklum's murder, which is to get back into the life of Crystal Merrill. So the jury, though, they went back to deliberate, and they were actually divided immediately on the question of whether Freeman was guilty or innocent. In a May 19th, 1987 article, the Times-Herald reported that it took the jury 5 votes before they could get a unanimous verdict. The initial vote resulted in a 6-6 split on guilt or innocence. A second vote shifted it to 7-5 in favor of conviction. They cast more votes. They discussed things. And in the next round, 8 jurors said, okay, we're voting guilty. 4 said, I'm not there yet. The next vote was 10-2. Now, finally, at 3 p.m. on Monday, May 18th, 1987, this is just 5 days before Freeman's birthday, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of 12-0 that Frederick Thomas Freeman was guilty of murder in the first-degree death of Scott Andrew Macklum. There is this letter to the editor in the Times-Herald on May 29th, just 10 days after the other article, describing jury deliberations and the number of votes needed to secure a conviction. And a reader moved to point out in this letter to the editor the disturbing aspects of the conviction. So this reader said, I have concerns because after all the testimony, at least 6 jurors said, I want to acquit, but then changed their minds within hours. And we have seen movies where we see jurors deliberating together. And there's always that move to get them to be convinced so that we can get out of here. And I wonder if that was part of it, that it's like, look, why are you trying to defend this guy? Didn't you see how he was smirking at us during the trial and how his alibi seems too perfect? There's something wrong with that dude. And I wonder if over time they just wore the others down. And that's just speculation. But I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, like I've seen this before in other cases. I mean, we've talked a lot about how my passion case is the controversial conviction of a man named Tommy Ziegler, who has been on death row for 50 years, where he's pretty much trapped in limbo because he committed a quadruple murder on Christmas Eve in 1975. But the case is so controversial that they don't want to execute him because it'll be a backlash. So they've pretty much allowed him to languish on death row for 5 decades. And I think they're hoping that he'll die of natural causes. But that strikes me as the ultimate example of a case where there were jurors who had some doubts and didn't want to convict him, but they wound up getting worn down. And there's an infamous story about how near the end of deliberations, the vote was 11-1, but there was one lady who just could not vote guilty. And she said that the other jurors started to bully her and intimidate her, and that at one point they brought one of the murder weapons into the jury room. And even though the gun was empty, one of the other jurors actually picked it up, put it to her head, and pulled the trigger in an attempt to scare her. And the judge, who did not like Tommy Ziegler personally, actually got a hold of this woman's doctor and instructed her to prescribe her with some Valium in the middle of the deliberations in order to kind of wear down her will. And she just decided finally to go along with the rest of the crowd and vote guilty. But she has done numerous interviews to say that she has regretted this decision for the rest of her life. And I always find that interesting about jury deliberations. Like, we obviously can't know what happened in the room in this particular trial, but to go from 6-6 and then a unanimous guilty vote within a matter of hours, it does make me wonder, did we see examples of this, of like bullying and intimidating, where some of the jurors said, well, I have doubts, but I'm facing a lot of pressure here and I don't want to be trapped in here forever and I just want to go home, so I'm just going to vote guilty.
Yeah, I'm a big believer here that Freeman just has that air about him that turns people off. It seems to me like if 6 jurors were saying, I favor acquitting him, and then later they changed their minds, I just have a feeling because they didn't have evidence against him as such. If they had been able to show that the fingerprint on the ammunition box was his, that would say a lot. And I've seen it in other cases where if you have some evidence, the prosecutor can lean on that evidence toward the end and just say, we know it was them because we found their fingerprint / DNA. They have something to show you that they were there, that they were part of this or did it. And in this case, they don't have that. What they have is their theory that he traveled 436 miles one way and then 436 miles back the other way. and committing a murder in between. So they don't have a murder weapon. They don't have any kind of evidence that his cars could even make it that far because they were breaking down all the time. For me, I don't know how they changed their minds except for the fact that people kept saying, this is a bad dude. We're going to get a bad dude off the streets because they can't tell us how he did it. They're just telling us that some eyewitnesses placed him there and that he had it out for Scott Macklem. That's literally their case.
You know this better than I do. Have any of the jurors ever gone on the record to explain why they changed their mind? Have any of them shared any stories about being bullied or intimidated or just having this feeling that, well, I'm not sure, but I just want to go along with the rest of the gang and vote guilty anyway?
I would say the top reasons reported were they really believed Renee Gobine, who was one of the strongest witnesses for the prosecution, who claimed to have seen Freeman driving away from the crime scene, or at least from the parking lot. This is also a person who went and got hypnotized by a teacher at the college because they gave the plate number to the police and the police said, this doesn't match anything. So then they went and got hypnotized and got like 13 more plates or 20 or something like that. And those didn't check out either. But apparently the hypnosis helped them remember more details. They also said they thought that his alibi was too perfect. So it couldn't possibly be real. It had to have been set up. And then the other thing they said was his arrogance. Some of the jurors were actually talking about his behavior during the trial. They could see him. He just didn't seem like he was taking it seriously. And I would say, having met the guy, I could see him going, that's not true. That's ridiculous. And he probably laughed about it or smirked about it instead of being concerned. And look, there's no way that you could probably prep someone for something like this if they're as strong a personality as he has, you know? So it's really difficult to say. We hold people accountable all the time for the way they sounded on a 911 call or how they behaved at a funeral. And you know what I'm talking about, Robin. All I can say is I think he lost the jury based on who he is. And I don't like that. And look, no one has to like this guy. And I get it if you don't. But I'm just saying, when it comes to a case, we want to be able to say, here's how we know they're guilty. Show it to us. And it's not based on their character. It's based on the evidence.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of cases where it seemed obvious that the jury convicted because they didn't like the defendant in particular. They didn't like their personality, or they learned about stuff in their background that they didn't like and figured, well, they must have been capable of doing this crime. But it's really troubling when you can't, as a juror, come up with a logical theory to explain how they did it. Like, as someone who has done so many of these cases on a true crime podcast about unsolved cold cases, I try to think up theories for how these crimes could have been carried out. And I'm just trying to picture myself in the jury for this one, like trying to ask the other jurors, do you seriously believe the plane theory? Do you think that he flew to this location and flew back? Or do you believe that the alibi witnesses are lying? That's why I often want to hear some of these jurors after the trials, like, provide explanations for why they reached their verdicts. And it's kind of like the same thing with the Henry Lee Lucas case I was talking about, where I think that the jury was completely disregarding the evidence that placed him in another state because they knew he was a notorious serial killer who had already been convicted of other murders. So they're probably just thinking, they're putting him on trial, he must have committed this murder, so let's just ignore all the other evidence and find him guilty.
Yeah, I do think there is something to that. I think there is a portion of the population, a percentage, that if a prosecution is taking someone to trial, to court, that they must have a good reason to do that. And, you know, I think if we were to poll prosecutors, most of them would say, I'm not taking something to trial unless I really believe I can win it. I think that's a thing. But in this case, I think they looked at him and said, we can beat you. Now, while awaiting sentencing, Freeman gave a phone interview, it said, with the Times Herald. And in it, he contended that Crystal Merrill, Renee Gobine, and this guy named Joplin, who was a jailhouse snitch, had all lied in their testimonies. Now, first of all, I think Fred does this interview because there have been a lot of accusations against his character. I mean, just on the whole, it was basically a character takedown. That's what this trial was, if you were to look through the trial transcripts. So Fred wants to address the accusations against him First, he insisted that he'd never raped or hurt Crystal Merrill as she had alleged, nor had he killed Scott Macklem. He denied being at the crime scene as Renee Gobine had testified and maintained that he never admitted to Joplin that he shot Macklem. He also told the media that Gobine was a close friend of Crystal's. This is something that never came up during trial. I don't even know if it's true, but, Freeman is saying that it is, and I think that's an interesting note that there's some kind of connection there between the two of them. Now, Freeman also claimed he declined to testify at trial because he was afraid the prosecutor would dredge up information that would be detrimental to his character. Believing that everyone has some skeletons in the closet, he told reporters that he thought the state would have tried to slander him due to some of his past misdeeds and questionable morals if he testified. Here's the thing, they did it anyway, even without him being on the stand. And I think this is probably something that eats at him. They were going to do this to him anyway, whether he was on the stand or not. And I think it would have been probably better for him had he testified, and I think he knows that. What do you think about that?
Well, I do know that in the majority of trials, most defense attorneys do not want their defendant to testify because sometimes they can put their foot in their mouth or just come across as unlikable or get caught up in a question that makes them look really bad. But I know in this one, there have been allegations that Freeman's defense attorney was very inadequate and did not mount a very good defense for him. So even though in most cases I would advise the defendant not taking the stand to testify, who knows if things would have turned out differently here if Freeman had done it. I honestly can't think of another case either where the defendant has given an interview to the media after he's been found guilty and hasn't been sentenced yet. It just seems like he took full control over his own case and was doing all the work to try to clear his name while his defense attorney was just kind of in the background.
There are accusations that Dean did not mount an adequate defense, and I don't know that that's true. I would say there were definitely things that he should have put to the court before trial, because obviously there were some times where the judge had to say, we're not going to do anything for you in that regard because you should have done this pre-trial. And I'd also say there are a couple other things that occurred during trial that I think he could have handled better. On the whole, I don't know that it was inadequate. I would say I would feel differently if I was in Freeman's shoes because he knows his case. I would argue that he knew his case pretty well back then. He knows it better now. But I bet he would have done a pretty good job on the stand. There is some information that I'll be covering later in the episodes that will show that maybe where he falls apart is under pressure. But if there are any questions that are claims about, where he was or what was happening, he would be able to give them very good information. This is a guy that would be able to tell you his alibi, tell you who he talked to, what they talked about. If someone asked me, should he have testified or not, he should have testified. I know it wouldn't all go his way, but I think he would be able to tell the jury, look, I'm willing to speak on this case. I'm willing to put my butt on the line. I think that would have been powerful. It doesn't mean he would have gotten through unscathed. They would have hit him with some stuff, no doubt. But I feel like it would have been better had he testified.
Yeah, even if he was found guilty, I have seen other wrongly convicted people who have had regrets about not testifying at their original trial. They're thinking to themselves, well, it's a huge risk. I may have been found guilty anyway, but at least I would have gotten my story on the record so they don't have to sit behind bars and think, what if? Could things have turned out differently if I had done this?
Now, Freeman also insisted that his girlfriend at the time, Michelle Woodworth, would have been able to provide a solid alibi, as he says she was with him that very morning, the time of the murder. But he maintained that she was threatened by Detective Bounds, the lead investigator, and therefore too afraid to testify. But you also have the prosecutor Cleland and Dean, the defense attorney, saying they couldn't find her in time for the trial. They both tried. Now, we could throw the prosecutor's comment out. Maybe, he doesn't care for Freeman, so why would he want to find this woman anyway? I would believe that maybe she didn't want to testify for multiple reasons, one of which is maybe she was afraid. She's trying to deliver this baby at some point, and she doesn't want anything interrupting her life. She's had enough problems. So they're like, oh, you need to talk to us, and you're going to be going to trial, and you're going to have to testify, and there are all these people asking all these questions. I think it was easier for her to go, I'm not in this. So I don't even know that she was necessarily threatened by Detective Bounds. I would almost say she's threatened by the whole situation.
Has she ever gone on the record since then to tell why she just hid out and did not testify?
I did watch an interview she did. Now, this interview was done with an advocate for Temujin Kensu. So whatever's up there is whatever they released. So I don't know the full scope of it, but I do know during that, she said that she was with him at the time of the murder. If the murder happened at 9 a.m. on the 5th, she was with him at that time. She's also reportedly talked about abuse too. So it's a real question, like why she didn't testify. But again, I think it was she didn't want to be involved in this whole situation. She had enough going on. Now, it's clear that the prosecution in this case didn't have the evidence they needed to show that Freeman was guilty of murder, but they did have what they said was evidence of him being abusive, being a manipulator, and being a liar. And one of the things they bring up is he had all these alibis. Mickey Ford was one of them. But the thing is if you ask Temujin Kensu, he's going to say, well, I was in some trouble in another state, and so I used aliases so I wouldn't get in trouble with the law. But be that as it may, when people say, well, I knew him as Mickey Ford, I knew him as this, I knew him as that. Well, the problem is then a lot of people will judge you for that. Even if you think you have the best reason in the world, a crime's a crime, right? And if you're going around using aliases, you're not being honest with people. But again, he says he has a reason to do it. So it's almost as though the jurors were sent a message that Freeman's this terrible guy, and he's the exact kind of guy who's going to commit such a murder. So given what we know about the trial, do you think Michelle being there in court and testifying, do you think it could have changed the outcome?
I mean, it is compelling if she goes on the record and says that she was with him at the exact time of the murder, because obviously if she's telling the truth, then the whole plane thing can be thrown out the window if he can actually be placed in the area when the shooting is taking place. But I have seen like a lot of other trials, wrongful convictions, where the defendant had a very shady background, and even though there was like very compelling evidence supporting their innocence, you can kind of tell that the jurors just had made up their own minds right away, that they thought the defendant was a bad person and they were capable of committing a crime like this. So they kind of discarded all the evidence that seemed to point away from them and still found them guilty. So who knows, if they had a dislike for Freeman right away, then maybe her testimony wouldn't have made any difference at all.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. If Michelle had actually testified at trial in his defense, I really believe it wouldn't have made a difference. That might sound interesting to a lot of people, but the fact that they had no evidence against him, there was no physical evidence, I find it hard to believe that her saying anything would have made any difference, because I think the prosecutor, Cleland, could have just pointed at her and said, that's his girlfriend, of course she's going to lie for him. Wouldn't you lie for your boyfriend? And she'd probably say no. And he'd say, I'm done.
But it is kind of a no-win situation, because they'll say, well, someone who cares about you, who knows you, is going to lie to provide you with an alibi, yet they're also accusing people who barely knew him of potentially lying to give him an alibi. So it's kind of a no-win situation either way.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that would have bolstered her testimony is if he had more than one person around him at the time. But given what time it was, where they were at, it was unlikely. So I don't think it matters. I know this is something people have been talking about. I want to talk about the end of the trial. I know we already talked about how it ended, but the trial saw closing statements by the prosecution and defense. And like I said, the prosecutor focused on trying to instill doubts about Freeman's alibi. He brought forward a lot of character testimony by witnesses who were at odds with Freeman, and pointing out how some witnesses claimed to have seen Freeman on the campus the morning Scott Macklin was murdered. The defense said, you've got no evidence against this guy. There's no fingerprint, there's no blood, nothing. And he's got this great alibi, as well as like, how would he even get from the murder scene to where he was seen in Escanaba in less than 3 hours? It doesn't make sense. And because of this, Freeman has had, Kensu has had a lot of support over the years. These people that support him, they included former Michigan Supreme Court Chief Justice Thomas Brennan, journalist Bill Proctor, B. David Sanders of the Proving Innocence Project, the Michigan Innocence Clinic, the Cooley Innocence Project, advocate Mike Mungan, and former Port Huron detective Herb Welser. There are many more, but I want to talk about former Michigan Supreme Court Chief Justice Thomas Brennan. He sadly passed away in 2018, but he reviewed the trial transcripts, and he said if he was the judge on that case, he would have dismissed it for lack of evidence. This has nothing to do with, was Freeman a bad dude? Because there are plenty of people lining up to say so, right? Is this really something you could take to trial? This Chief Justice said he would have thrown this whole thing out. And this gets right to the heart of the legal case against Freeman. Many believe he is guilty and reference his alleged behaviors and his alleged abusive behavior, while others who say he's innocent of the crime point to a lack of evidence showing that he was involved at all. So when you are looking at these complicated cases and there's so much passion involved, what factors do you rely upon when you're trying to figure out whether someone was truly guilty or innocent of the crime for which they've been accused or convicted?
Well, I think that's a very important point that this Chief Justice did say that he reviewed the trial transcripts, because in recent years, I have heard allegations on places like Reddit that a lot of the people who believe that Ken Sue is innocent are only looking at the bullet points. They're looking at the narrative that has been pushed forth by the innocence organizations and the whole thing about how, oh, the prosecution tried to say that he rented a plane to commit this impossible murder. But here's a legal expert who's not just passionately saying all this stuff because he's read like a few paragraphs about it. He did review the trial transcripts, and I do think that's very important that the people who try to lobby for someone's innocence like review all the evidence and look at all the different factors and look at the transcripts just to know that they've seen the whole picture. And if this legal expert who has a lot of experience with these types of cases says that this is so bad that he would have thrown it out, then I think it does have a lot of weight.
That's what kind of gets me about this is I do understand when people get on Reddit or wherever and say, oh, his supporters only know some bullet points. Well, the great way to counter that is to actually show us the evidence. But I've looked at their evidence. I've seen the posts. I've seen the posts that say he's guilty. He allegedly raped people. He allegedly abused people. Okay, what connects him to Scott Macklem's murder? That's what I want to know, because when we get down to it, we need to be able to show the motive, the means, and the opportunity. And here, what do they have? They have arguably a motive. I'm not sure. It really depends on whether you think the prosecution did a good job of trying to say this woman who he had, if you want to argue, dated or not, whatever, had dated for a very short period of time in the spring. And all of a sudden, towards the end of the year, he decides that he needs to kill her fiance so he can get back with her. What prompted that? Well, according to the prosecution, it was that Freeman was biding his time and that he was going to back up his threats, his alleged threats against Macklem and Merrill. And this is how he did it. He waited enough time and he pounced, he got it done, and then he created this super alibi. That isn't enough for me. I need actual evidence. And they did find evidence in this case, but it just didn't match up with him. So this is kind of what bothers me about it. At the end of the day, I just want us to have true justice. I want us to be able to back it up, because if we were to simply say this person's bad, now I can do this or that to them, we could have a lot of injustices happening, because that is where it can be abused. I need to see the evidence, and I'm not seeing it here. And people can convince me of why they think he's guilty in terms of his character, but I want to see, how do you think he actually did? I haven't seen that. That 3 hours it's just too much for me. It just doesn't make sense in my mind that he could have committed the murder at 9 a.m. and been back in Escanaba by noon.
Yeah, because I know when you sent me the email announcing that you were doing an entire season about this, one of the first things I had to ask you was your opinion, because I know this is one case where there was a big pro-innocence narrative for years, but in recent years it seems to have gone back towards pro-guilt, and your answer was, I honestly don't know. And I trusted your opinion because you read all the trial transcripts, read all the material, and I understand the dilemma here because Scott, from what I've heard, was a good guy with no known enemies, so I can't think of any alternate suspects who might have had a motive to kill him besides Temish and Ken Sue. But at the same time, can you actually plant him at the actual murder scene? Is it physically impossible for him to have done this? And that, in the end, that's the only thing that really matters. Like, not his character, not his whether or not he was abusive or he raped people, but whether he could have traveled 400 miles to another town and committed this crime in a limited time frame.
One question I'm sure people have is, he's the only suspect they identified. Why couldn't it be him? Well, the problem is if you have a detective here like Bounds, who'd never run a case like this before, then you can support it by saying, hey, he didn't look hard enough. The only reason they even focused on Freeman was because of Tracy Merrill saying, hey, here's what I think. And there's this guy and he was dating my sister. And here's all the stuff he did. And it's like, oh, now we found this dangerous guy, this ninja, and we think he did it. They just didn't have a true investigation here. Not in my opinion. And I think if they had, maybe that would have answered the question of why there was no one else who was being pointed to as a possible suspect. Because if you only have one suspect in a case, I'm sorry, but a lot of times that's just going to be a problem because there should be more than one suspect in most cases. And it just feels like this was kind of like, well, we got a guy, so now we're going to focus on him and we'll make it all work.
And that what really bothers me about wrongful convictions is if an innocent person is put in prison, then the real perpetrator is going to continue to get away with it and possibly harm other people. Because if Kensu is innocent and Scott was killed by someone else, for all we know, this person has gone on to commit other murders and we just don't even know about it. And that was the thing with Henry Lee Lucas that they showed in The Confession Killer near the end of the series, is how many of the murders that Lucas confessed to and was convicted of did the real killer go on living their lives and harming other people and got to be free men for many years longer than they deserved to. And that's what really bothers me when the wrong person is put in prison, is when law enforcement seems to not even care that they might have got the wrong person. All they care about is that they have closed the case, yet you may be letting another violent person run free and do harm to other people.
I guess that's where we leave it, Robin, because at the end of the day, it seems like we're in agreement that we just like to see a good case against somebody. And whenever anyone has an alibi and it messes up your case, all we're asking is that you get back to work instead of just doubling, tripling down. And unfortunately, it feels like closing cases, even, by way of strawberry milkshakes or what have you, is more important than actually getting justice. I guess that's my whole drive behind this with Framed is, depending on who you ask, you're probably going to get a different answer on whether Temujin Kensu is behind bars for a good reason or not. And I just wanted to answer the question myself by reading through all the documentation. And luckily this year, I was able to get the rest of what I needed. And I've seen everything. I would urge people to read the trial transcripts, but I know it's a lot. But I would just say, think about how you could be put away. All you need is for your character to be trashed and for people to make accusations against you and then have a jury believe it. And you too could be put away behind bars for many, many years, if not your whole life.
Yeah, that's what's terrifying, is that a lot of the people who get wrongly convicted sometimes have said afterwards, I never thought it would happen to me. I mean, sometimes the people who are sent to prison are bad people who are criminals and have done bad things in their lives. But there are other cases where people who are otherwise law-abiding citizens wound up being railroaded for a crime they did not commit and were sent to prison and just thought, well, I never thought it would happen to someone like me, but it did. It could easily happen to you.
Yeah. Well, all we can do is try to get the word out on what we think is important when we're dealing with these cases. And I'll admit, Robin, I probably fell into the trap like many others did, years ago, where I really wanted to answer the question, like, is this person guilty or not? And it would become more of a personal thing. But here I'm literally looking at this case and trying to be as objective as possible because it doesn't impact me one way or the other. It's just a question of what does it take to convict somebody? And the last thing I'd say is I wonder how this case would go if this was tried in, say, 2021 instead of 1987, because this case relied so much on speculation about a plane, about character testimony, and maybe worse, eyewitness accounts from people who'd never seen Freeman in their life before, and all of a sudden are like, oh yeah, that was the guy.
Yes, I have seen a lot of older wrongful convictions which were made possible by what is today recognized as junk science, and I do agree that if they took this exact case to trial today, I'm not so sure if a jury would find him guilty. And one thing I wanted to ask is, if I recall correctly, didn't they find a box of shotgun shells near the murder scene which had a fingerprint which did not match Kensu?
It was an empty box, and there was a fingerprint. It did not match him.
And I'm thinking today they might not just check it for a fingerprint, but they could run DNA testing on it to see if Kensu's DNA is on it or if there's DNA belonging to another offender. But I have a feeling that the state does not consider that to be a priority.
Well, you know how it is once you get a conviction, they don't really like to mess with it.
And I have a feeling, that even if they do believe that they've got the wrong man in prison, they're probably just hoping that he'll die off and he'll cease to be their problem.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. And if anybody is unfamiliar with your show, I highly recommend it. Just like you, I was fascinated by unsolved mysteries. And that was a big part of why I became interested in mysteries and in cases, because we all want to know the truth. Keep being curious. And I look forward to seeing you again sometime. I usually see you at the conventions.
I haven't seen you in a while, so it was great to have you invite me on. Thank you so much for doing it. And this was a very fascinating case to discuss.
Thank you, Robin.